What is up, YouTube? It's your boy Red Chaos One, and I am back with another video. Now, I'm sorry that I've been away for a while. I think I mentioned it in my last video. I'm in university and I was doing some papers. Yeah, my final year, some papers. I do law, by the way. If you didn't know, I do law. So that's why I haven't had the time recently to do my usual thing. But I am back. Fully back to, my usual posting. I usually post every week, sometimes every couple of days. So I am back. And I am back with a rant video. Not really a rant video, just me spewing nonsense, which can be described as a rant. So I am a fan of fantasy. I think I've mentioned that enough times. If you watched my past videos, I'm sure I've mentioned it whenever I'm talking about fantasy. And I write a fantasy web novel as well. So I'm that, and as a fantasy guy, it's law that I should be obsessed with the lore of some stories. Like, I'm that guy on the internet who's usually going, but this doesn't make any sense, this lore of this. That guy who knows way too much about the lore of World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy 14. Yeah, I'm a lore guy. I'm a world building guy. I'm even thinking on making some videos about world building. So, here's the thing with world building in many fantasy stories that really confuses me. When you go into a fantasy story and you find a fantasy race, they'll usually have their own kingdom, which is exclusively about that race. Like the humans, they have their human kingdoms. The elves have their elvish kingdoms. The orcs have usually they're not given kingdoms, they're usually just given tribes. So yeah, the orcs have that, the dwarves have that. Let's go the stereotypical usually used fantasy races. So the orcs, the dwarves, maybe the goblins as well, humans, they're always gonna be there. So each race has their own thing. This never makes sense to me in the sense that in these stories, we're not coming into them with these kingdoms recently being made. In universe, when we get there, we're reading the story, you're talking about maybe 2, 5, or even 10,000 years have passed. And that leads me to an interesting question. Why don't we see any intermingling between the kingdoms? Like, when a massive war goes down between the elves, and an elvish kingdom or tribe is beaten, you never see the elves migrating into human, orc, or dwarf territory and kind of settling there and possibly becoming part of the kingdom in future. Why is that? Because even in real world mythology, real world history, you kind of see many kingdoms intermingling in certain areas when they're close to each other. And I know you can make the excuse that, Red, the kingdoms they might be far from each other, but that in fantasy it doesn't work that way. In fantasy, lots of kingdoms are extremely close. Like, just take a walk outside, boom, you're in the elvish woods. Because for those of my viewers who have tribes, you usually have tribes, you've noticed that some people in your tribe might not entirely have ancestry in it. They probably got intermarried, which rarely happens, which also kind of seems strange because in many fantasy stories you get hybrids being treated as though they're this unknown thing. Oh my god, it's a hybrid, a human elf hybrid. Like, dude, humans and elves have been living as neighboring kingdoms in your story for 8,000 years. You mean to tell me that in 8,000 years, no elf ever went, that human's kind of hot. Like, no one ever did that. Because that just doesn't make any sense to me. Like, there should be lots of intermingling. And another thing is, even if you say maybe they won't intermingle in that sense, maybe they're like, oh, we're superior to this race, we don't breed with them. I mean, what about when they conquer them? Because I rarely ever get to see this in fantasy, but it seems like whenever wars of conquest are fought between certain races, they'll be fought with each other. Like if elves want to conquer territory, they go against other elves. No elf ever goes, my army is superior to my human or dwarf or orcish neighbors. I can just take over those guys' territory. We never see that happen. And that never makes any sense to me. Like, you never see conquering empires, conquering tribes. You never see that in these stories. And a lot of them try to be realistic. And I don't know, man, that just doesn't make any sense to me. Like, unless you're talking about societies which have 21st century values, if they're more medieval, they're gonna be doing conquests. Like, even if it is a human empire, you mean to tell me that your evil human emperor isn't going to be interested in intermingling with a race that could make his heirs immortal? Or with a race whose affinity for magic could be useful to him? But just look at the map of the Roman Empire at its height. Like, I'm going to post it right here, you can see it. The map of the Roman Empire at its height. That's a lot of land and a lot of territory. You have the Gauls, you have the Egyptians, you have the Middle East in there. You never really see that in fantasy stories where you have like one kingdom with multiple races intermingled into it. Like, each race has their specific corner. And even on the interbreeding thing, orcs are basically, in modern fantasy, usually written as fantastical Mongols. Not as an insult to any actual Mongols. And I know a lot of fantasy writers clearly are not intending to code these fantasy creatures as real world people. But in a sense, they're your usual nomadic, conquering, slave-taking race. And I don't know how to tell you, dude. In real life, those cultures, let's just say some of them had some practices that you wouldn't like. And even then, some of them would intermingle with the people who they've captured as slaves or who they've conquered in order to, build that feeling of kinship between the people, because the kids are going to be from both sides, so they won't rebel in future. I can never see that. And maybe I'm just a weirdo, but I want to read a story in which an elf king basically rules a bunch of orcs and giants. Maybe that's what I want. Maybe I just want the stories to have something more interesting. Because I always find this group has their own thing, has their own kingdom, and this group has their own kingdom. Like, yeah, you can have a certain race have a higher demographic in a kingdom. That makes sense. Like, if you come here to Africa, where I am in Zambia, you will find more black people than there are people of other races. More than there are Asian people, more than there are Indian people. But you will find Asian and Indian people here. The thing is, we're in Africa, so yeah, it's a given you're gonna find more black people. But if you were to go to a place like, let's say, ancient Greece at its power, under Alexander the Great, you would be seeing a wide variety of people, which is just insane when you actually think about it. But, where was I? Sorry, random rambling. yeah, that's the point that I wanted to bring. I've always found it weird in fantasy stories that this happens, that every kingdom is separated and completely dominated by one race throughout. Like, you never have the dwarf, like a dwarf basically go, I could make a lot of money going to the humans and making weapons for them. Because in stereotypical fantasy, the dwarves are always the makers of the best weapons, second only to the elves sometimes. But you never see a dwarf going, "Yeah, I'm gonna leave my kingdom and go to the humans where I could make more money, and where since I would be the only person doing that until someone else actually had some smart business sense, I could make money and." They'd probably get married to a human, or they could take their extended family, and their extended family get married to a human, and then you see human dwarf hybrids, even though those are extremely rare. We never see that, and like I said, it just confuses the heck out of me because these stories usually have their fantasy worlds the cultures in their fantasy worlds, those kingdoms, be thousands and thousands of years old, and you never see that. You never see refugees going to other kingdoms, intermingling. You never see that. You never see people going, why don't we, breed with these guys? Or you never have an example of maybe people hiring orcs. Like, yeah, why doesn't anyone ever hire orcs to be part of their militaries? Because everyone knows those guys love to fight. So better to have them on your side. But, other than that, I'm just saying, maybe it could be nice to see more variations on fantasy kingdoms rather than the usual you go to the dwarf kingdom and it's entirely dwarfs from as far as you can see, and you will never run into a member of another race there. So yeah, I'm just saying, just a random rant from me. My biggest pet peeve in fantasy. It's not my only pet peeve. There are others. I might talk about them in the future, and I am thinking on doing a couple videos about fantasy world building and my ideas, so I can talk about those in future. So this has been Red Chaos 1. The usual. If you like my channel, you can leave a like, you can subscribe, you can tell me what you want to see me do in the future. And I also have a book, my fantasy story, Phantom Ddraig, in which multiple races can live in one kingdom. So there's that. And yeah, so you can check it out. There's a link to it in the description below. So this has been Red Chaos 1, signing out.